We're looking in this chapter at the Presbyterians, and quite a bit of what we're covering here ought to be familiar to you from previous chapters, because the Presbyterians are connected with the entire Reformed movement. As a matter of fact, part of what this chapter is about is the other Reformed, and what happened to them, where did they go to. The only ones that actually turn out to have much of a presence these days turn out to be the Dutch Reformed. The rest of them got absorbed into the Presbyterians or into the Congregationalists, and we'll talk about why in a few moments. But to say that they're Reformed or Calvinist tells you an awful lot about their emphases, about what it is that's distinctive to this tradition. So this will be a little bit of review. Let's think about some of the key things that you remember about the Calvinist tradition, or like some of the terms or ideas or distinctives, as we call them in religious studies, that come to mind. Yeah.
They like to believe in their roots and like the Bible.
Very good. So, the Protestant Reformation is about sola scriptura, Bible alone, but these guys took it a bit further. Martin Luther would say it's okay to have the Mass more or less the way it was. Calvin would say, look, unless it's in the Bible, forget it. You've got to get rid of it. It's anti-Christian. So that's one really key distinctive. What else? Yeah.
Predestination.
Yeah. This notion that from all time God has chosen who's going to heaven and who's going to hell, who's going to be saved, who's going to be damned, and that there's really nothing you can do about it. Some advocates of predestination went so far as to say that you really don't have free will, at least when it comes to matters of salvation, in any important respect. You do have free will in the sense like you can choose whether to eat a salad or eat a steak, but whether you're going to live a godly life or a worldly life, they would say that that's not up to the person. And then there were some other things that went along with that, like the limited atonement. Christ didn't die for everybody, just the people who were saved. What else is really important, do you think, for Presbyterians and for the Reformed in general? Yeah.
Original sin.
Yeah. That's part of why predestination is so important. Because you're right. Because original sin is why the damned are going to hell. But for them, that's kind of rolled into there. You're right too in thinking. Calvin went back to Augustine, and Augustine really emphasized original sin. So these guys who are going back to Calvin are going to emphasize that as well. But what else? Think about the term Presbyterian. How did we use that before? Not to talk about a denomination, but to talk about something else. Yeah.
A priest or an elder?
Yeah. So you have these elders. There we go. Presbytery. And these elders are the ones who really exercise authority within the church. It's not just the minister or preacher. You have these elders, and how do they actually find new elders? They choose them. And they're the ones who are involved with church discipline. They're the ones who decide, for example, who gets to go to communion and who doesn't. With the Puritans, when we looked at them, they would actually decide who can be a full member of the church. So this means of organization is very important. Calvin thought that this was biblical. This was the main way that the early Christian community had organized itself. So your book talks about a couple people in Scotland. Why is Scotland so important? That's not the only place that the Reformation went to. What was that? Oh, must be like a truck or something. There's this guy, John Marist. You'll sometimes find John Knox schools or colleges because he's a very important person for the Presbyterian denomination or movement. He's the guy who sort of brings Calvin to Scotland. And if you look at a map these days, Scotland doesn't look that far away from Geneva. Just think about what it was like back then. You know, Calvin and the Calvinists were down in Switzerland, and France was pretty hostile to them. England had gone the way of the Anglican Reformation. There were some Puritans in England. This guy John Knox goes all the way down and comes all the way back up. Scotland is so far north that, you guys all know about, the northern sun in summer, how it almost doesn't set in some places. Scotland is like that. That's how far north we're talking about. And travel was difficult back then, so this is a pretty important thing. And like it says, he brings Calvin's ideas and Geneva's ideals to what they're calling something like a Celtic backwater torn apart by warring clans. And Presbyterianism, Calvinism, becomes something really important for Scottish. I'm never really sure whether you're supposed to say Scottish or Scotch. I'll just put both. Identity. I know there's some rule for when you use one or the other, or Scots too, you can say. But I don't know the rule. But this becomes really central. The Scots who leave the Catholic Church, and that's most of them, become Presbyterians. And Scotland and England have this long-term antagonism as well. So this fits in with the political rift between Scotland and England too. So this notion of covenant that we find in the Presbyterian or Reformed movement becomes very important for their political life. All of this stuff starts to pervade the culture. Now, your book talks about organizing, Presbyterian polity. That means forming a Presbyterian church, something official, something that would be long-lasting. And why are we interested in all this Scots stuff if we're talking about religion in America? It's interesting, right? I mean, Scottish people are curious and they have a funny accent. Scotland, by the way, nowadays is very cosmopolitan, if you ever go there, once you get far up in the hinterland. Why are we so interested in this for religion in America? Yeah.
A lot of people came from Scotland into America, so
Yeah.
they brought with them their traditions.
Exactly. Immigration is how everybody got here, including the Native Americans, as we talked about. And there's the Scots, and then there's what's called the Scots-Irish. Do any of you have Scots-Irish ancestry? You ever wondered what does that mean? Those are the Northern Irish, the people who were brought originally from Scotland to be sort of, the vanguard of the English invasion. That's the way the Irish would look at it. And they became Presbyterian. They emigrated from Northern Ireland and they emigrated from Scotland in part because those are pretty inhospitable places and there was much greater opportunity in the colonies. Like your book points out, by the time of the American Revolution, the Presbyterians were the second largest religious group in the United States, well, in the colonies. The American Revolution was actually called by some of the people at that time that Presbyterian Revolution because they threw themselves into it, as opposed to some of the other religious groups that weren't so into it. The American Revolution was not quite as popular as people make it out to be. The Presbyterians had a major role in that. Your book talks about a few other things that we want to point out as well. So you've got these Presbyterians emigrating to the United States. And you can tell by sort of looking at all this stuff that there's a key aspect on order, on structure. The presbytery, they keep order, they keep discipline within the church. Everything is supposed to be drawn from the Bible. If you're going to sing anything, it better be a biblical canticle or even better, a psalm. Now, when you say this term order, and you think about religion, you think about a lot of rules, right? And what do you think about more, the head or the heart, when it comes to that sort of stuff? How do you know the right order of things? You just kind of feel your way to it? Or is it something you memorize? Think about it. Think about your student conduct code. You know, if you get into an argument with a professor, can you just say, I felt I was doing the right thing? Will that fly? Probably not. Now, if you actually look at it and you read it and you think about it, now you're on firmer ground. Some of your professors may not actually know what the code says. Order can get kind of stifling, though, sometimes. Some of you may have had experiences of this when you were growing up. If you belonged to religious communities where you felt like it was just a lot of rules and doing this at the right time and doing that at the right time, but your heart wasn't in it. And so your book talks about something else that occurs, and this produces some breaks within the Presbyterian community. We talk about what they call the Great Awakening. And this was a sort of resurgence in religious fervor in the United States that played an important role not only for religion, but also for politics, for culture, for literary works. Some of the other people that we're going to look at later on, we're going to talk more about this, so don't forget this term. The Presbyterians that would be most closely associated with this Great Awakening were these guys, the Tenets. And your book talks about them starting this log college. Now, the Presbyterians in general were very focused on things being orderly in church, having ministers who were hopefully, sort of like university trained, college trained, seminary trained. And this log college is doing something a bit different. Like your book says, Tennant, who wrote this tract, does it mention it in your book about the dangers of the danger of an unconverted ministry? He was focused on the heart, on the emotions, or as they called them back then, the affections. Whenever you see this term religious affections, you should think about the emotions, because that's what they're referring to. And he developed a new way of preaching, at least for Presbyterians. Other people were doing this as well. Rather than just taking a scripture passage and saying, here's what it means, and here's, the evidence for that, and here's how to apply it to your life, he was focused on getting people to feel differently. You can think about an academic lecture or an old school sermon as trying to produce a conversion in your intellect, right? So after we have this little session in class and I do some Q&A with you and sort of lay things out, hopefully some of the material that you've read is a little bit more consolidated in your head. This is your experience with college classes, I think. That's why lectures still have some usefulness at all. Does it affect your heart? Do you find yourself, on fire and saying, wow, this is really changing me. I see things with a whole new way. Probably not an academic lecture. It would be strange if somebody actually jumped up and said, hallelujah. It all makes sense now. That would be kind of weird. I don't expect that to happen in my classes. If you want to freak me out at some point, I suppose one of you could do that at some time. I'm not even sure what I would make of it. It's never happened, thank goodness. Because, honest to God, I don't know what I would do. But that gives you an idea of how different that is. Now, this guy was interested in producing conversion of the heart. That's why he was talking about the dangers of an unconverted ministry. His idea was that the people who were actually doing the preaching themselves should have had an emotional conversion experience. They should have come to, meet Jesus, not just face to face, but heart to heart. That should be evident in the way that they preach. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to do a very good job, and they're not going to be able to produce that for their congregation, the participants in that. So this started a big, rift within the Presbyterian ranks. This points to a kind of tension that constantly goes on between order, let's call it the tension between order and affection. Which one are you going to favor? Which one are you going to focus on? What are some of the dangers of too much of either one, in your view? Don't necessarily think about something religious. Think about clubs that you belong to, or other activities that you've been involved in. Or think about academic classes and lectures. What's the danger of having just order, just an emphasis on that? What happens? Yeah.
There's no enthusiasm or passion or desire to learn at all.
Yeah.
You just go through the motions.
This is a big problem for a lot of things in academics. And then after a while you start saying, why the hell am I doing this? Just for the grade, just for the credit. This is really, what would be the word? This is really, starts with a B? Boring. Yeah. What happens if all you have is touchy-feely, now tell me how you feel kind of stuff? Have you had any classes like that? I have. Terrible. I'd almost rather have the boring lecture than that. What are some of the dangers of too much of a focus on emotion? Yeah.
It can make people feel uncomfortable and won't be really focused on learning as much.
Yeah. You might not want to share how you're feeling. You might not want other people in that business, so to speak. And you might not want to know what other people are feeling too. Could it keep you from doing what you need to do? If all you have is this sort of unstructured, emotional, it gives you a lot of passion to do things, but then you're sort of like just running around. The Presbyterians were trying to deal with an age-old problem. How do you bring the two of these together? And for the most part, they came down usually on the side of order. As a matter of fact, if you go to a Presbyterian church, you will meet people who talk in terms of the heart, but you'll also see, for the most part, a lot of emphasis still on discipline, on structure, on order, on that as being part of their tradition. They also talk about higher education in here, and that's starting to become more and more of an important thing as we go on through these other chapters. A lot of Presbyterians were in New Jersey. What's an Ivy League school in New Jersey?
Princeton.
Yeah. Now, your book talks about that starting out as the College of New Jersey. Then, changed its name. A lot of colleges have changed their name over time. That started out as a Presbyterian establishment, just like Harvard started out as a Puritan school. And the job was to train ministers, and then to train other people as well. Over time, if you go to Princeton now, do you think you'd see a lot of Presbyterian influence? Probably not, right? Any more than you would at Harvard. But that was the origin of it. A lot of our important early educational institutions had religious roots. Now, your book talks about some of the main churches involved in the Presbyterian Church, but I'm going to skip over that, and we'll talk about that in later chapters. I also want to look at what happened to some of the other Reformed. So the Reformation starts in Germany, and then it spreads all over the place. And when we talk about the Reformed in the Reformation, we're talking about the people who are influenced by Calvin, they're part of his movement. So we're talking about Switzerland, we're talking about Germany, we're talking about the Netherlands or Holland, and we're talking about France, and then we're talking about other places like Hungary as it spread. Most of those nationalities, they had their own national Reformed churches. Oh, I touched with the Welsh as well. They ended up more or less disappearing. Quite a few of them ended up here in the United States getting absorbed into Presbyterian churches. The one group that was successful in maintaining its own ethnic identity was the Dutch. And your book actually talks about this slogan, if you're not Dutch, you're not much, that they say up in Michigan, where there are a lot of Dutch Reformed. Calvin College is in that area. There's quite a few here still in New York. The county that I used to live right next door to in Indiana also has a very high proportion, Jasper County has a very high proportion of the Dutch Reformed, and that's where I actually heard the expression, if you're not Dutch, you're not much. They tend to be kind of closed off, but it's partly because they have a religious identity as well as an ethnic identity. They're not speaking Dutch, by the way. They're speaking English, but if you go to areas like that, you'll find a lot of Dutch names, like Rensselaer, or what would be some other ones? I have a hard time pronouncing these Dutch names, Studevant, or... Now the Dutch Reformed, like your book talks about, ended up splitting into a couple different churches as well. And I give you some information about that in the I Learned lessons. Why did the Dutch retain their identity, do you think? That's an interesting puzzle. Why did the French disappear into the Dutch churches and into American Presbyterian churches, but the Dutch not? Any ideas? The book doesn't tell you. But it's interesting sometimes to speculate about this stuff. This is something scholars actually are kind of divided on. We know that it did happen. Probing the roots of the why, asking a philosophical question, is much more difficult. With the German churches, they disappeared in part because in Germany these churches got rolled into each other. The ones that spoke English, it was very easy for them to disappear into Presbyterian denominations or into Congregationalist denominations. Dutch is significantly different. You might then say, well, why did the French? Well, there were more Dutch than there were French in most of these areas, so the Huguenots, the French Reformed, often would just join Dutch churches and take on Dutch identity. That's not a full answer to the question, but it's worth considering.